are literally shaping the planet.
Purpose is the only pathway to a regenerative future.
We have a choice to stay with the status quo or to change.
What is the point of trying to be just resilient when we can actually innovate?
Thank you, everyone, for listening in. So hopefully I can sort of, I guess, give you a little bit of an insight into what we do in Voyage Control and sort of talk about some of the things that we've seen with our customers and also just seen generally around the world. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to sort of get a sense of, firstly, hopefully you'll be able to see it. So cool. Great. Great. Nick, is that showing?
It is, yep.
Excellent. Cool. Okay, great. So what I really wanted to focus on in the session today is about making the supply chain, I guess, more sustainable. To give you some background to the business, the business is currently called Voyage Control. Actually, the very first name of the business was Carbon Voyage or Carbon Voyage. And the original thesis of the business was actually around sustainability in transport. And sort of back in 2013, when I pivoted into what we have at the moment, the sort of pivot not only involved a sort of a change of focus and everything like that, but it also sort of highlighted that sometimes there's a challenge around selling sustainability into very large customers. That being said, the platform that we have now launched in October 2013 in the events industry in the United Kingdom. We currently have close to about 4 million deliveries that have been scheduled on our platform by about 100,000 businesses all around the world. And we work with about 30 large owners and construction firms all over the place. And hopefully, there's some sort of insights that I can bring to bear on that, and hopefully you'll recognise a couple of the names on there. Just to give you a bit of an insight into what we do as a business, this won't take too long. So the idea of the platform at the moment is really around helping our customers digitize and manage logistics and supply chain. Interestingly, we started when this went live initially with looking at things like freight sharing. But the reality back then, and probably even still to some extent now, is that a lot of sustainability ideas are great on paper and certainly make a lot of sense, but sometimes there is an inherent challenge around getting to the sort of scale required for something to happen. That being said, the platform is there to really help our customers sort of schedule their deliveries into loading docks, manage resource allocation, and manage inventory control. Because a lot of these things just aren't managed very well. And then for some customers and in some jurisdictions around the world, compliance is a very big thing. As mentioned, we work with both GCs and owners. In some contexts, our customers have a multitude of assets under management that we're supporting, or they'll have different use cases, but fundamentally for either of them, we're going to need to sort of support them. And one of the big areas where support has to be provided is really around the issue of reporting around things like sustainability. The platform as it currently stands is divided into two things. One is around delivery management and one is around inventory control. The focus very much for all of our customers is on operational efficiency. However, it is important to sort of reiterate, and I think hopefully one of the big things that you'll take away from this is being efficient is almost certainly going to also equal being more sustainable on a job site in terms of logistics or indeed through the supply chain. And we certainly have enough sort of horror stories from customers about losses and damages of inventory and things through the supply chain. Before I sort of delve into sort of some construction related things, I thought I'd sort of share a case study that sort of illustrates that point that having an efficient and effective supply chain sort of works very nicely with being more sustainable. So we look after 2 container terminals in Los Angeles, and we sort of move about 150,000 containers a month, which is a couple of percentage points of all containers in the United States. If any of you have read about container terminals in Los Angeles, you'll have inevitably read about queuing and congestion and problems like that. So the use of a digital platform like ours sort of has been there to help minimise queuing and congestion. Queuing and congestion is important operationally because when you have trucks queuing, they are potentially only able to do 1 or 2 container moves a day, as opposed to sort of the 3 or more that they really need to do to sort of meet the client demand. So operationally, there's a very big impetus there. Within about sort of 6 or 12 months of us rolling out the platform, not only had we sort of created that operational efficiency, but from an environmental perspective, we'd sort of saved 1,700 days worth of truck idling time. And that sort of has a very big environmental impact as well. So it's a really good sort of example of where you do have that sort of, confluence of both operational and environmental sort of efficiencies there together. And it's important to think that actually a lot of things that do come onto construction job sites around the world, and certainly in the United States and elsewhere, do come through container terminals. So they are part of the logistics and supply chain requirement that you have. As Nick kindly mentioned, I have a military background, so it's pretty common for me to talk about a military quote somewhere in any talk that I do. So I always like this one from Sun Tzu, which is all about the line between disorder and order lies in logistics. And I sort of think that in many respects that sort of does apply in the construction industry as well. If we think about a supply chain for construction, this is a very, very simplistic model, but ultimately construction supply chains are complex and rarely efficient. They sort of involve consumption and waste. So it's consumption at the factory and consumption throughout the whole supply chain until it gets to the final location that it's meant to go in. And ultimately, both from an environmental perspective and a financial perspective, what you really want to do is minimize the unnecessary consumption and the unnecessary waste through the supply chain. So I've got a couple of examples which hopefully will help to sort of illustrate some ideas around that. I think the first and most important thing for any person who is interested in this topic is really about, sort of using this quote from Lord Kelvin, which is ultimately about if you don't know what's going on and you're not sort of really understanding what's happening through your supply chain, you don't really, and you're not measuring it, then you really can't manage it properly. And inevitably in the sort of frenetic nature of construction projects, often that means that there's a lot of unnecessary waste that goes on, which really doesn't need to happen. The UN back in sort of 2015 sort of tried to set out a series of goals for where they sort of wanted the world to be in. And so this is sort of, I guess, painting a bit of a strategic context for sustainability in construction more generally. So the UN sort of published a number of sustainable development goals as they pertain to absolutely everything in the world. And a number of them definitely have a big element that is very applicable to construction. And not just construction, really the built environment. As sort of world populations increase and as populations become more urbanized, that is going to have a very big impact on the sort of housing stock and the building and the related infrastructure that's going to be required to support it. So actually, in the sector that we all operate in, trying to think about how we can operate more sustainably, both in the building and development of the built environment, and then the operation of that is very important. So the World Green Building Council and sort of similar bodies have come up with a series of very specific sustainable development goals that are very, very focused around the sector that we all operate in. And I'll sort of touch on one or two of these things. And sort of out of this came a thing called Advancing Net Zero. And I've got an example of one of our client sites, which I'll talk to. But each of these things has an impact on how we think about logistics and supply chain. And if I sort of just touch on one or two of the examples here, and I'll sort of slightly go from left to right. The more we can, when it's talking about, how can you create renewable energy and create buildings that are cheaper to run, the more you can do that, the less you have supply chain requirements to support that. The more you can think about a green infrastructure and supporting the needs of local communities, the more efficient you can become. And certainly the sort of negative view of all of this also is that as we consider, climate change challenges in the world, that also behooves us to think about where there are requirements to think about how infrastructure is going to be resilient against some of the climate change threats that exist. So when we think about supply chain and logistics, ultimately there's an interesting thing about who cares. And this is very important for construction companies to contemplate in different parts of the world, because depending on where we are in the world, we get different sort of perspectives on this from different customers. Some governments around the world are very, very heavy on this. And certainly in a place like Australia, there are some very, very strict rules around this. What is important and very interesting, though, is the sort of very intimate relationship that sort of exists between things like safety and environment, which you may not necessarily sort of put together in some parts of the United States. Increasingly, we see that shareholders and clients are not content to just look at what's happening within a construction company, but really want to understand what's happening throughout the supply chain. One of the biggest projects that we're doing in the United States is with Madison Square Gardens. It's a $2 billion facility in Las Vegas, and they have a very clear mandate to look at everything that is going on throughout the whole supply chain. And so that's sort of something that we're starting to see more with our customers around the world. The other part of this is not just sort of who are the people who are paying the money, but actually, what does having a better supply chain and meeting environmental objectives mean to employees in the local community? And it is very important to sort of consider these things as well. The community aspect is not just about trying to do something nice for a local community. It is potentially a critical part of things like planning permission, and logistics plays a particularly big role in that. Sort of touching on reporting and compliance as it sort of pertains to sort of supply chain and logistics. Fundamentally, we see that there are really two drivers to this around the world. One is going to be what happens from government, and one is that comes from customers and shareholders. The reality is that I think from a government perspective, in most sort of G20 countries, governments are very sort of keen on ensuring that there is regulation in place to support this. And also critically, it's not just national governments that do this, it's also city governments. And certainly sort of in the United States, the the requirements around compliance are potentially more driven at a city or state level than necessarily at a federal level. The other sort of part, though, is what happens from a customer perspective. I wanted to sort of just throw up these little statistics from one of our client sites, and this is where our customer has to provide reporting to one of their customers, because their customer is a listed company in the United Kingdom who has to provide sort of public reporting on their environmental impact. So this is not something that we've necessarily seen so much in, say, the US construction industry, but certainly in Europe and Australia, that is an important thing. So I suspect that in the next few years, this will become a greater and greater thing. The other sort of big part here will be where there are large sort of pension funds or sovereign wealth funds who are sort of doing the development, and they'll absolutely be driven by doing this kind of reporting around environmental impacts and so on. So probably the area that I know probably better than the most things is really around logistics, and logistics can really bring together, I think, three things, and these things can all happen in one hit. So I wanted to sort of put in a picture of a vehicle that has been tracked on our platform. So this is for Australia's largest infrastructure project, which is Sydney Metro. So I just wanted to get a picture of one of the journeys that is tracked on our platform. And that's done through our mobile apps and all that kind of good stuff. And I think it sort of illustrates that there's a very nice sort of connection again between these three things. The purpose of the vehicle tracking operationally is to know if the vehicle is going to be early or late to deliver whatever they're delivering. And that's very valuable from an efficiency perspective. But at the same time, doing that sort of operational activity also has benefits around safety and sustainability. From a safety perspective, it means that you can ensure that the driver is not speeding, has had enough rest, and all those kind of things. And then from a sustainability perspective, it's allowing you to understand what the driver is doing, ensuring that they're not sort of idling around a corner, creating air pollution challenges. And so on. So this is hopefully a nice little example of where technology can drive both environmental improvements as well as operational improvements. The reality for logistics in future, though, is I think a couple of things. The first is cities are going to become more and more congested. And so the challenges of getting vehicles in and out of cities is going to be harder. The picture on the right here is what's happening in the UK, in London, with the ultra low emission zone. Exactly the same thing is going to happen to most other major cities around the world. So this is going to have an impact on how logistics operates going into absolutely everything within those areas, not just construction. But what it'll also mean is that there'll be an increased sort of look at what is happening with logistics activities. And certainly in a place like London, there are requirements to put in place construction logistics plans and delivery and servicing plans to ensure that any developments are not going to have any negative impacts on the local community. Another big trend that we certainly see in the United States in the ports community. So, we have about 3,500 trucking companies that use our platform in Los Angeles. And there's a huge amount of desire by the sort of port authorities to advance the environmental agenda as much as possible, which is great. And one of the ways in which this will sort of ultimately sort of see things moving is actually things like electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. And so that is sort of a very, very big trend that is going to sort of happen. And then potentially the use of cross-decking of vehicles coming from one location into an inner city location and using consolidation centres where potentially they need to think about changing the vehicle to move into certain areas is going to become important. And then the other thing I just sort of wanted to show here was as supply chains become more sophisticated and as people think about how they're going to move things around, it's going to also become very clear that people are going to want to have a sense of what type of transport they're going to be using and really start to look at this across multimodal requirements that they may have, and sort of compare the use of container ships to trucks or rail and everything like that. And these will become part of the considerations associated with the movement of logistics around. The other thing I sort of wanted to sort of touch on, and I appreciate I'm sort of close to running out of time, was really about the sourcing and reuse. Because ultimately the logistics performs part of the supply chain activity. And the other thing is what is being moved through the supply chain, which ultimately comes down to where things are coming from and how they're being used or reused on job sites. And there was a really cool thing I read about called green steel. And I just sort of thought it'd be great to sort of bring that up. Obviously, steel and iron ore is very, very important on most sort of construction sites and everything like that. But it's sort of, hopefully, it's definitely something worth sort of doing a little bit of research on. I think it's still a bit new as an idea, but the idea of something like green steel is it's a more sustainable form of steel, and it relates to the way in which iron ore is turned into steel and so on. And so there's really great stuff around the type of materials that are being brought onto construction sites. Indeed, the use of things like 3D printing and modular construction, which helps with reducing wastage. And ultimately, the quality of the supply chain will become very important as well. We see that in other industries, particularly fast-moving consumer goods, where the sort of origin of materials becomes very important when we think about things like modern slavery and so on. And this will become a feature of what's happening in construction. And I sort of just wanted to almost finish on this, where this is our second construction project that we did in the United Kingdom quite a few years ago. And there are sort of two great statistics here. And so Advancing Net Zero is the World Green Building Council initiative around meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. But there was sort of these two great sort of statistics that stood out. Firstly, really trying to minimise the amount of construction waste. And then also the fact that they're able to use recycled aluminium in the facade of this building, which I think is not only a great success story of what happened here, but really where business as usual should be going. I thought I'd sort of, just before I finish, I'd come back to this here and sort of show this again. Because ultimately this is where a lot of the industry still is. There are inherent complexities around how things are managed through the supply chain in terms of financial risk, contracting relationships, and so on. But this is sort of where business as usual is. And really, hopefully, in the last 20, 30 minutes, I've been able to sort of give you a sense of how this is, as business as usual, not really what needs to happen. And this whole sort of notion of consumption and waste needs to change to minimising consumption where possible, and certainly looking at minimising waste and reuse. And I think fundamentally, I think the two sort of key takeaways is really sustainability and operational efficiency go hand in hand. And the more efficient a supply chain is, the more efficient a job site will be, and the more profitable it will be. And I think over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, supply chain management will become a key differentiator in construction as to how companies get to the top of the ENR 100. that was all I was going to sort of go through. Nick, and I think hopefully I'm almost on time, so I think we'll end it there if that's good.
Yeah, James, that was outstanding. Thank you so much. You've got a minute or two here while we're waiting for Tom, our next speaker, if you want to open the floor up for any questions. And so, yeah, if anyone in the audience has any questions for James, feel free to put them either in the chat or the Q&A. And then we'll introduce Tom here in just a second for his talk. No questions so far, James. So yeah, thank you so much. No need to
awesome.
to stick around. Appreciate it, and have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you back in the build track later on.
Cool, awesome, great, thank you.